In 1934, British social anthropologist J.D. Unwin published the results of a lifetime of research in a book titled Sex and Culture. Unwin was interested in seeing whether there was a link between sexual freedom and the flourishing of a culture. As part of this work, he examined data from 86 societies and civilizations. What he found was that increased sexual restraints always led to the flourishing of a culture. Conversely, increased sexual freedom always led to a collapse of a culture 3 generations later. In the introduction to the book titled Children's Sexuality and Sexualization, edited by Emma Reynolds from Cardiff University, Jessica Ringrose and Danielle Egan, the editors problematize the traditional Christian understanding that the child should not be viewed by adults as a sexual being, and hence the child should not be sexualized. In this, they reference Michel Foucault, the French philosopher who, in the 1970s, along with many other French intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, argued for the complete abolition of the age of consent laws in France. They write,
in his first volume on the history of sexuality in Western Europe, Foucault notes that the child's sex was the object of intense scrutiny and pivotal in the deployment of a shifting disciplinary apparatus, which foregrounded the project of normalization and surveillance in the late 19th century. As with most ideas on sexuality, cultural values ebb and flow at various periods, and ideas about the sexual child are no different. For example, the assumptions at work in the discursive production of the sexual child from the 1970s stand in stark contrast to most contemporary narratives on the child and its sexuality.
They also write,
the phenomenon of sexualization phobia provides an excellent example of all that is irrational and ahistorical about the sexual child in our contemporary culture. Sexuality and cultural scholars have used empirical and comparative studies, as well as history and critical sociology, to argue that sexualization is itself a constructed and unsubstantiated concept.
The editors identify some of the problematic effects of not acknowledging children as sexual beings. They include, number 1, overemphasizing the victimization and objectification of girls, thereby reducing any sexual expression as evidence of sexualization. Number 2, denying girls sexual agency, rights, pleasure and desires. Dr. Esther McGeaney is co-author of The Future of the Sex and Relationships Education Curriculum in Wales. She is also, along with Alice Hoyle, a co-author of a book titled Great Relationships and Sex Education, 200 plus activities for educators working with young people. The book is enthusiastically endorsed by Professor Reynolds. The book references queer theorist Gail Rubin's Charmed Circle. This is a concept referenced under a chapter titled Thinking Sex, Notes for a Radical Theory of the Politics of Sexuality, in the book Culture, Society and Sexuality. Rubin argues that some sexual practices are regarded as socially permissible, whilst others, such as cross-generational sex, are regarded as taboo. Rubin writes,
like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone for their erotic orientation.
Reynolds and McGeaney were keynote speakers at an RSC Day for Welsh schools in June 2020. Then Deputy Minister for Mental Health, now Education Minister Lynn Neagle, was very supportive.
I believe RSE is a child's right, which is why I'm so pleased that the Senedd enshrined that right in law through the Curriculum and Assessment Wales Bill that we passed shortly before the Senedd elections. Empowering children and giving them agency in their lives is crucial for their well-being. RSE really is children's rights in action.
Reynolds and McGeaney are supporting schools in the Central South Consortium.
We've got relationships and identity, sexual health and well-being, and empowerment, safety, and respect. And in the code, what we have is the content for each of those strands set out in those 3 developmentally appropriate phases. So phase 1 is from age 3, phase 2 being from age 7, and then phase 3 being from age 11. So we've recently published a number of resources, and we have an ongoing programme of professional development around RSE, provided by not only our lead practitioners, but our external providers, Professor Reynolds from Cardiff University, who is providing a keynote presentation later on today, and Dr. McGeaney from the University of Sussex, to support schools.
In 2019, the Muslim Council of Wales invited psychologist Dr. Kate Godfrey-Fawcett to deliver a talk on relationships and sexuality education at Cardiff University.
In a talk held in Birmingham and published online, she made reference to protests at Parkfield Community School and claimed sex education in the UK was potentially sexualizing children, redefining traditional families, and creating confusion that could lead to psychological damage, spiritual damage, and also physical harm. In another, she said the lessons were part of a concerted effort of queering the Muslim community and called being transgender a mass delusion.
Labour Senedd member for Cardiff Central, Jenny Rathbone, wrote a letter to the University Vice-Chancellor expressing concerns the talk would be contrary to community cohesion. The talk was cancelled. Dr. Kate Godfrey-Fawcett's views were not allowed to be heard. The suppression of unwelcome views for the good of community cohesion was also the reason grooming gangs operated with impunity in the metropolitan borough of Rotherham, as explained in a report by Louise Casey, published in 2015.
The case of child sexual exploitation in Rotherham was a catastrophic example of authorities turning a blind eye to harm in order to avoid the need to confront a particular community. The town saw upwards of 1,400 children sexually exploited over more than a decade, groomed by predominantly Pakistani heritage men offering drugs, alcohol, and attention, followed by sexual abuse and mental and physical coercion. Despite the widespread knowledge of this practice across the local authority, statutory partnerships, and many local residents, those with the power to act chose to defend community cohesion and political correctness over the vulnerable children in their care. Destroying evidence of perpetrator ethnicity and shutting down services was preferable to confronting criminals from a minority ethnic community. Such was their fear of offending local cultural sensitivities.
Telford is a town in Shropshire. Like Rotherham, it has been another centre of activity for sexual abuse by men of Pakistani heritage, including, according to one testimony, the sexual abuse of a girl from a seaside town in Wales. This is an extract from a documentary made by Charlie Peters for GB News.
I spoke to another victim of child abuse in Telford. Emily, not her real name, prefers not to appear on camera, but these are her words, spoken by an actor.
At college, I met Andrea, who was a little bit older, and she introduced me to local Pakistani men who worked in the kebab house in my town in South Wales. We would just go to the kebab house where we'd receive free food, free drink, free cigarettes, free alcohol. It was all just a treat for us, which we loved as young girls. When I was still 14, Andrea took me to the promenade in the town where we met the Pakistani kebab house workers, and then 5 or 6 of them gang raped me. I knew 3 of them from the kebab house, but the others I'd never met before. There were 3 kebab houses in the town, and they all knew each other, and they linked up when they raped me. They were all linked. We were trafficked to Telford, Hereford and Blackpool. I was 14 and 15 during this period when I was raped and trafficked regularly. My mum was so happy that I'd found friends, but she had no idea what was going on.
Just as I'd found in Rotherham and Rochdale, the gangs of abusers used the boyfriend model of exploitation to lure in their victims.
While my abusers threatened, raped and violated me, they were also kind, but it would change. They called us gory girls, white bitches, white slags. When I eventually got my police records back, there are 200 to 300 pages about how I'd been strangled, threatened with a knife. Someone was sent to petrol bomb my house. I was raped over 1,000 times, and I don't even know how many men assaulted me. It was just a thing that happened to us, and it might sound crazy, but it was just normal. It felt normal. It's all we knew.
Emily's suffering represents one story in a much wider pattern of abuse. This crisis was not isolated to a few towns. It had swept the country. Reports from Rotherham, Rochdale and Telford were joined by stories from dozens of other towns and cities.
In 2006, controversial preacher Dr. Zakir Naik was invited to speak at St David's Hall in Cardiff. Influential Welsh Muslim and Secretary-General of the Muslim Council of Wales, Salim Kidwai, described Dr. Zakir Naik as one of the most uncontroversial Muslim speakers. He said,
"It's very important that he speaks in Cardiff because he is a great authority on various religions and has helped to bring people together. Educating the educators. That is the name of the conference."
Dr. Zakir Naik explains his position on the rape and murder of girls who don't follow Islamic dress code.
If, hypothetically, you rape a girl and you murder her, and if the court of law in this world cannot prove, and then you truly repent, will Allah forgive you? And you say, most probably Allah will forgive you. And you're right. If you have committed rape and murder, and if you truly repent and ask for forgiveness, as I told, there are 5 criteria required for forgiveness. Number 1 is you admit what you have done is wrong, that the sin that you have done is wrong, admit it. Number 2, see to it that you stop it immediately. Number 3, see to it that you don't do it again. Number 4 is that you ask forgiveness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If all these criteria are fulfilled, inshallah Allah will forgive you. Even if you have committed rape, which is a major sin, and if you have committed murder, it's a major sin. But if you truly repent, Allah will forgive you. As we know, Allah is Rahman Rahim. Now coming to a second question, that is this not injustice to the girl who was raped and murdered? And I would say no. Because both the person who raped is undergoing a test in this world, the person who was raped also is undergoing a test. And let me explain to you that Allah has given guidelines to the woman that they should dress up modestly, they should cover the complete body, except those parts can be seen that is the face. Now if after giving all these guidance, and hypothetically, if that girl doesn't dress up modestly, she is dressed up immorally, which people get excited and the rape is done, who's to blame? It is the girl to blame. That doesn't mean that the boy has a right to rape. But besides the boy who committed the rape and murdered, it is the girl who also has to follow the guidelines of the Quran. If she wore obscene clothes because of which the rape took place, then she is responsible. But if she wore normal clothes and yet if the person rapes, then it is a test for the girl. For the girl, was she following the advice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by wearing appropriate clothes or not? If she was not, then she is to blame to attract the men to rape.
A Grooming Gang survivor explains the religious justifications used by her abusers to justify their actions.
Tell us about that.
Well, a lot of it's to do with race and religion, which a lot of people don't really like talking about, and they don't like to hear it. But this is why I feel compelled to talk about what's happened and what is still happening. Because people need to hear it from survivors that these are racially and religiously aggravated crimes. That when I was being beaten, I was being called a white slag, a white whore, a white cunt. That over and over again, the references to my whiteness was always at the forefront of my perpetrator's mind. And that was always linked in with religion and his idea of what a good Muslim was and a bad non-Muslim was. Or a good believer and a bad unbeliever. Even though I was a Christian, even though I have my faith in God, I pray, I believe in heaven and hell, I believe in good and bad, good and evil. So, but in the minds of these grooming gangs, if you're not covered down to your ankles, down to your wrists, if the hem of your top doesn't cover to your knees, then you're asking to be raped. Or, if you're not washing in the way that you should wash as a Muslim, if you're eating pork, you're unclean, you're dirty. If you use a knife and fork, you're dirty. If you don't eat food with your hands, sounds like I couldn't never quite understand that. It's the opposite way around. But so there's lots of narratives within these grooming gangs which make hatred of white people a justification for what they're doing. And also scriptural things like, we're allowed to do this, we're permitted to do this to you once you've started your periods. So we can't do it to you. And before you've started your periods, we have to do thighing, which is another type of sexual molestation, which doesn't involve penetration.
In a report for the Family Education Trust titled Unprotected, How the Normalisation of Underage Sex is Exposing Children and Young People to the Risk of Sexual Exploitation, Norman Wells writes about the factors that have contributed to the normalisation of underage sex. Chapter 15 was headed Sex Education, Undermining Parents and Pursuing Short-Term Goals. Wells writes,
The independent inquiry in Rotherham found that, typically, children were courted by a young man whom they believed to be their boyfriend. Over a period of time, the child would be introduced to older men who cultivated them and supplied them with gifts, free alcohol, and sometimes drugs. Children were initially flattered by the attention paid to them and impressed by the apparent wealth and sophistication of those grooming them. Many were utterly convinced that they were special in the affections of a perpetrator, despite all the evidence that many other children were being groomed and abused by the same person.
Wells argues that teaching children about sexual pleasure undermines safeguarding. He references a booklet produced by the Centre for Sexual Health at NHS Sheffield.
The idea of sexual intimacy having anything to do with commitment and self-giving is totally absent from the booklet, and love receives only passing mention. The whole focus is on the short-lived pleasure to be derived from fleeting sexual encounters, rather than on preparing young people for the lasting pleasures of a lifelong union, based on something deeper than physical attraction and self-gratification. It is highly doubtful, however, whether it is realistic to combine information about sexual pleasure with the message that everyone has a right to it and then not expect young people to want to try it. It is a message that is playing into the hands of the unscrupulous, who stand ready to exploit it to their own ends.
The Welsh Government mandate that children are taught about pleasure from age 11. In a chapter titled The Sexual Rights of Children and Young People, Wells references a document produced for the International Planned Parenthood Foundation, which was co-authored by Dr. Esther McGeaney. The report was titled, How do we assess the capacity of young people to make autonomous decisions? The report stated,
With an enhanced understanding of young people, autonomy, and sexual rights, we hope to be better placed to promote and fulfill our vision of a world where young people are recognized as rights holders, decision makers, and sexual beings, whose contributions, opinions, and thoughts are valued equally, particularly in relation to their own sexual and reproductive health and well-being.
Wells writes,
The only reference to the age of consent in the entire paper appears in connection with the equalisation of the age of consent between homosexual and heterosexual young people and between the different countries within the UK. Other than that, the impression is given that sexual pleasure and enjoyment is a right and a choice that can be freely exercised regardless of age. Indeed, we are told that comprehensive sexuality education is necessary in order to support the development of young people's capacity to make decisions and affirm their right to make choices about when and where they have sex and what kind of sex they have.
Some people believe that this is a groomer's charter. You either recognise sexual rights for children or you have child protection. You cannot have both. Conservative leader in the Senedd, Darren Millar, asked for a commitment from the government to an inquiry looking into the issue of child sexual exploitation by grooming gangs in Wales. The fluid, Ellen Jones, accused him of using overly descriptive language. Elynyd Morgan was very disappointed.
We know from media reports that young girls have been recruited by grooming gangs here in South Wales before being gang raped and then trafficked to Telford, Hereford and Blackpool. One victim has even said that she was strangled, she was threatened with a knife, and her home was threatened with being burnt down. She was then raped, I'm afraid to say, First Minister, 1,000 times. She didn't know the number of perpetrators because there were so many.
I do need you to come to your question now. You are being overly descriptive and I think verging on not being totally respectful of the victim at this point. So can you tone down the rhetoric slightly?
I'm afraid I'm simply reading facts.
No, you're not.
No, you're not.
The use of language in this place needs to be making sure that you are keeping well away from inflaming any kind of discrimination or inciting of any kind of discrimination. You were doing very well, Darren Miller, with your first two questions in avoiding that. In your third one, you've become overly descriptive, and I need you to now reflect on that and just ask the question again, please.
I am not seeking to inflame anything.
Good. I'm glad you confirmed that. I'm glad you confirmed that. Now carry on with your question.
Yes. So we know that some of the things which have been described by victims have been absolutely sickening. We know that those things have taken place, young girls in Wales have taken place in terms of recruitment by grooming gangs in Wales.
Darren Miller, I ask you for your question.
So we need to know that these things, we don't have another Rotherham or Rochdale on our doorstep.
Darren Miller, you're keeping to your script now and you're not listening to my advice. If you do not ask your question in the next 10 seconds, I'm going to ask you to sit down. I did not expect to have to do this to you in your first few weeks as leader of the Welsh Conservative Party in here.
My question is this. Given that you oppose a UK-wide inquiry, given that we haven't had the assurances which I've sought from you today, and given the extent of public concern, will you now commission a Wales-wide inquiry into child sexual exploitation by grooming gangs here in Wales?
Darren, I've got to say I'm really disappointed in you. I wasn't expecting you to take on that kind of approach.